Imagine walking across the quiet hills of central Turkey on a cool autumn morning. The air is still. Wildflowers sway gently in the breeze. Birds circle above weathered stone walls that seem too enormous to belong to an ordinary ruin. At first, nothing feels unusual. It is peaceful, almost forgotten. Yet beneath your feet lies one of history's greatest mysteries. 3,000 years ago, these hills echoed with the sound of bronze hammers striking glowing metal, merchants calling from crowded marketplaces, horses pulling royal chariots through towering gates, and priests offering prayers inside magnificent temples. This was Hattusa, the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire, one of the greatest superpowers of the ancient world. Its kings negotiated as equals with Egypt. Its armies marched across Anatolia and northern Syria. Its scribes filled libraries with thousands of clay tablets. Its engineers built walls so massive they still dominate the landscape today. Everything about this empire suggested strength, stability, and permanence. Then, it disappeared. Not just from power, but from memory itself. For more than 3,000 years, humanity almost completely forgot the Hittites had ever existed. Shepherds walked among their fallen gates. Farmers plowed fields above buried palaces. Travelers admired the strange ruins without knowing whose city they had found. It was as though history itself had erased an empire powerful enough to stand beside the greatest civilizations of the Bronze Age. How does that happen? Did invading armies destroy Hattusa? Did famine slowly weaken the kingdom until it collapsed? Did rival princes and ambitious nobles tear it apart from within? Did mysterious raiders sweeping across the Mediterranean deliver the final blow? Or is the truth far more complicated than any single explanation? Tonight, we reopen one of archaeology's oldest cold cases. We will follow explorers who uncovered buried cities, listen to kings speaking through clay tablets silent for millennia, examine the clues left inside abandoned temples, and search for the whispers that survived after the empire itself was gone. Some clues will challenge everything we think we know. Others may raise even greater questions. Explorer, before we take our first step through the ancient gates of Hattusa, remember one thing. Sometimes history is not lost because the evidence disappeared. Sometimes history is lost because no one knew where to look. And somewhere beneath these silent stones, the Hittites are still waiting to tell their story. Imagine walking across the quiet hills of central Turkey on a cool autumn morning. The air is still. Wildflowers sway gently in the breeze. Birds circle above weathered stone walls that seem too enormous to belong to an ordinary ruin. At first, nothing feels unusual. It is peaceful, almost forgotten. Yet beneath your feet lies one of history's greatest mysteries. 3,000 years ago, these hills echoed with the sound of bronze hammers striking glowing metal, merchants calling from crowded marketplaces, horses pulling royal chariots through towering gates, and priests offering prayers inside magnificent temples. This was Hattusa, the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire, one of the greatest superpowers of the ancient world. Its kings negotiated as equals with Egypt. Its armies marched across Anatolia and northern Syria. Its scribes filled libraries with thousands of clay tablets. Its engineers built walls so massive they still dominate the landscape today. Everything about this empire suggested strength, stability, and permanence. Then, it disappeared. Not just from power, but from memory itself. For more than 3,000 years, humanity almost completely forgot the Hittites had ever existed. Shepherds walked among their fallen gates. Farmers plowed fields above buried palaces. Travelers admired the strange ruins without knowing whose city they had found. It was as though history itself had erased an empire powerful enough to stand beside the greatest civilizations of the Bronze Age. How does that happen? Did invading armies destroy Hattusa? Did famine slowly weaken the kingdom until it collapsed? Did rival princes and ambitious nobles tear it apart from within? Did mysterious raiders sweeping across the Mediterranean deliver the final blow? Or is the truth far more complicated than any single explanation? Tonight, we reopen one of archaeology's oldest cold cases. We will follow explorers who uncovered buried cities, listen to kings speaking through clay tablets silent for millennia, examine the clues left inside abandoned temples, and search for the whispers that survived after the empire itself was gone. Some clues will challenge everything we think we know. Others may raise even greater questions. Explorer, before we take our first step through the ancient gates of Hattusa, remember one thing. Sometimes history is not lost because the evidence disappeared. Sometimes history is lost because no one knew where to look. And somewhere beneath these silent stones, the Hittites are still waiting to tell their story. The first clue in our investigation is not hidden beneath the ground. It is hidden in a simple question. How does an empire become powerful enough to stand beside Egypt, yet disappear so completely that the world forgets its name? To answer that, we must travel back more than 3,000 years, when the hills of central Anatolia were alive with a civilization few people today have ever heard of. As the first light of dawn reached the valleys surrounding Hattusa, the great gates slowly opened to another day. Bronze-clad guards took their positions upon towering walls. Merchants guided wagons filled with grain, wool, pottery, and precious metals toward the bustling markets. Blacksmiths worked glowing bronze into tools and weapons whose ringing echoed through the streets. Priests climbed the temple steps carrying offerings as smoke drifted gently into the morning sky. Royal scribes carefully pressed wedge-shaped symbols into soft clay, recording treaties, harvests, royal decrees, and messages that they believed would serve the kingdom for generations to come. For the people living there, this was simply another ordinary morning. None of them could have imagined that one day their voices would fall silent for more than 3,000 years. The Hittites did not begin as rulers of a vast empire. Like many great civilizations, they started as a determined people living among the rugged mountains and fertile valleys of Anatolia. Over generations, they united neighboring lands, strengthened their cities, and built an organized kingdom capable of defending itself against powerful rivals. Their capital, Hattusa, grew into one of the most impressive cities of the Bronze Age. Massive stone walls stretch across the hills for miles, protecting temples, royal residences, workshops, granaries, and busy neighborhoods where thousands of families live their daily lives. Standing before those walls today, it is difficult not to wonder how ancient builders, working without modern machines, created defenses that have survived earthquakes, wars, and the passing of millennia. As the kingdom expanded, so did its ambitions. Hittite kings forged alliances, negotiated treaties, and led armies across Anatolia and into northern Syria. They understood that strength alone could not build an empire. Roads had to remain open. Trade had to flourish. Diplomats had to succeed where armies could not. Caravans carried copper, tin, fine textiles, timber, horses, and luxury goods across enormous distances, connecting the Hittites to a thriving international world. Their scribes became remarkable record keepers, preserving not only their own history, but also treaties, legal codes, religious ceremonies, and correspondence with neighboring kingdoms. Those humble clay tablets, created for the ordinary business of government, would eventually become the greatest gift the Hittites left to future generations. Ironically, while kings believed they were writing for their own time, they were actually writing for ours. Then came the moment that announced to the ancient world that the Hittites had become a superpower. Their rulers faced one of history's greatest civilizations as equals, Egypt. Two mighty empires stood on opposite sides of the ancient Near East, each determined to protect its influence, its allies, and its future. Their rivalry would eventually lead to one of the largest chariot battles ever fought and, later, to one of the earliest surviving international peace treaties known to history. Think about that for a moment. Long before Rome rose to greatness, long before medieval castles crowned the hills of Europe, these two civilizations were already negotiating peace through written diplomacy. It is one of humanity's earliest reminders that even the strongest kingdoms sometimes discover that wisdom can achieve what war cannot. Looking at the Hittite Empire during its greatest years, nothing suggests that collapse is anywhere on the horizon. The cities are thriving. The temples are busy. The harvests fill the granaries. Diplomats travel confidently across international roads. Children play beneath walls that seem as permanent as the mountains themselves. If someone had stood in Hattusa on one of those peaceful mornings and whispered, "One day the world will forget all of this," almost no one would have believed them. Yet somewhere beyond the horizon, forces were already beginning to gather. At first they seemed small. A failed harvest, a delayed caravan, an uneasy alliance, a troubling message carried by a royal messenger. Alone, none of these signs appeared dangerous. Together, they would become the opening chapter of one of history's greatest disappearances. And our investigation is about to uncover the first warning that something had begun to go terribly wrong. If empires could speak, the Hittite Empire might have told us that its greatest enemy did not arrive carrying a sword. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, disguised as ordinary problems. The first failed harvest did not destroy the kingdom. Neither did a delayed trade caravan or an argument inside the royal court. Great civilizations are remarkably resilient. They survive difficult years. They recover from defeat. They rebuild after earthquakes and droughts. But sometimes history presents a challenge so overwhelming that no single victory can overcome it. Looking back across more than 3,000 years, archaeologists now believe the Hittites were facing not one crisis, but many, all unfolding at the same time. Imagine standing inside the royal palace at Hattusa as messengers arrive one after another. One reports poor harvests in a distant province. Another brings troubling news that important trade routes have become increasingly dangerous. A third carries word that neighboring kingdoms are asking for grain because they too are struggling. Each message, taken alone, seems manageable. Together, they paint a picture no ruler wishes to see. Modern scientific studies have added an unexpected clue to this ancient mystery. By examining the growth rings preserved inside long-lived trees, researchers have found evidence suggesting that parts of Anatolia experienced years of severe drought during the empire's final decades. Imagine watching rivers shrink, wells produce less water, and fields that once fed thousands slowly turn dry beneath an unforgiving sun. A kingdom can store grain for one difficult season. It can even survive two. But repeated years of poor harvests test every part of society. Farmers lose hope. Food prices rise. Soldiers require supplies that become increasingly difficult to provide. Hunger begins spreading far beyond the countryside. Although drought alone probably did not destroy the Hittite Empire, it may have weakened the very foundations upon which its strength depended. Nature had quietly entered our list of suspects. Then another warning appeared far beyond Hattusa's walls. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms that had traded with one another for centuries began experiencing their own crises. Merchant ships disappeared from familiar sea routes. Caravans arrived late or failed to arrive at all. Cities once filled with commerce grew strangely quiet. The Bronze Age world functioned much like a vast network. Copper came from one region. Tin arrived from another. Timber, horses, precious stones, grain, and luxury goods crossed mountains and seas before reaching distant capitals. Remove enough pieces from that network, and even the wealthiest kingdom begins to struggle. Imagine trying to run a modern nation if every major highway, shipping port, and supply chain suddenly stopped working. Daily life would quickly begin to unravel. The Hittites were discovering the same painful lesson more than 3,000 years ago. Yet perhaps the most unsettling clues came from inside the empire itself. The Hittites understood that the greatest danger to a kingdom was sometimes ambition within its own royal family. Their history had already witnessed assassinations, disputed successions, and struggles for the throne serious enough that earlier kings created laws to reduce bloodshed between royal heirs. They knew from experience that enemies outside the walls were dangerous, but division inside the palace could be fatal. Some surviving records hint at growing political tensions during the empire's final generations. Governors struggled to maintain order in distant territories. Loyal allies became uncertain. Powerful families protected their own interests as pressure mounted. We cannot reconstruct every conversation held behind the palace walls, but we know enough to recognize a familiar pattern. When people begin losing confidence in tomorrow, unity becomes increasingly difficult to preserve. Then comes one of the most haunting discoveries made by archaeologists. When they carefully studied Hattusa, they noticed something that refused to fit the story of a sudden invasion. Many valuable objects were gone. Certain official records appeared to have been removed. Some important buildings showed signs of being emptied before the Great Fire that eventually consumed parts of the city. It almost looked as though someone had seen the storm approaching. If that is true, then the people leading the empire faced an impossible decision. Do they remain in the capital and risk losing everything? Or do they leave behind the city their ancestors built, hoping that somewhere else the Hittite kingdom might survive? Explorer. This is where our investigation takes an unexpected turn. Because before we ask who destroyed Hattusa, we must first ask a far more unsettling question. Did the Hittites abandon their own capital before the flames ever appeared? For a moment, let us step away from kings, treaties, and armies. Great civilizations are not built by rulers alone. They are built by ordinary people whose names history rarely remembers. Imagine the streets of Hattusa during its final years. A bronze smith wipes the sweat from his forehead as the fire in his workshop burns lower than usual because charcoal has become difficult to obtain. A merchant stands beside an almost empty wagon, wondering why the caravan from the south never arrived. A farmer looks across fields that should have been green but now cracked beneath the summer sun. A temple priest offers prayers with the same devotion as always, yet notices that more people come seeking hope than offering thanks. These are not specific people whose names were preserved on clay tablets. They are the countless men and women whose lives gave an empire its heartbeat. And when enough ordinary lives begin to change, history itself begins to change. Inside the royal palace, the atmosphere may have felt very different from the confidence of earlier generations. Messengers arrived carrying reports that demanded immediate attention. Governors requested assistance. Border commanders warned of growing instability. Trusted advisors gathered around maps spread across stone tables, searching for solutions while knowing every decision carried enormous consequences. One proposal protected the army, but weakened the harvest. Another preserved the capital, but left distant provinces exposed. Every answer seemed to create another problem. The Hittite kings had inherited one of the greatest empires of the Bronze Age. Now they faced the frightening possibility that no decision would be enough to save it. Then came the silence. Not the silence of a single day, but the slow silence of a civilization losing its rhythm. Fewer wagons entered the gates. Fewer traders filled the marketplaces. Fewer fires burned on distant hills after sunset. Every generation knows the feeling when something familiar begins quietly disappearing before anyone fully understands why. At first, people tell themselves it is temporary. Next season will be better. The caravans will return. The rains will come. The kingdom has survived difficult years before. But hope becomes harder to hold when every season brings another disappointment. Looking back today, archaeologists can identify many clues. Living through those years, the people of Hattusa could only see one uncertain day at a time. Then we arrive at one of the most haunting questions of our entire investigation. If the leaders of the empire realized the capital could no longer be defended, how do you tell an entire city that it is time to leave? Imagine opening the great gates, not to welcome merchants or victorious soldiers, but to watch families quietly depart carrying only what they could lift. Sacred objects carefully wrapped. Clay tablets loaded onto wagons. Children holding tightly to their parents as they walk away from the only home they have ever known. We cannot say with certainty that events unfolded exactly this way. The archaeological evidence suggests preparation before the city's final destruction, but many details remain unknown. Still, the possibility itself is deeply moving. The greatest tragedy may not have been the fire. It may have been the moment people realized the city they loved could no longer protect them. And then, the flames. Who started them remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries. Some scholars believe invading enemies burned parts of Hattusa. Others suggest sections of the city may have been intentionally destroyed after it had already been abandoned. The evidence refuses to point decisively in one direction. The stones tell us a fire happened. They do not tell us who held the torch. Yet perhaps the fire was never the true ending. By the time smoke rose above the walls, the Hittite Empire may already have been slipping away, one difficult season, one painful decision, and one lost opportunity at a time. Explorer, if the fire was only the final chapter, what erased the Hittites from the memory of the world for more than 3,000 years? That is the final mystery we must investigate. If the story had ended with the fall of Hattusa, the Hittites would still be remembered as another great empire that rose and eventually declined. History is filled with civilizations that lost wars, abandoned capitals, or disappeared from power. But the Hittites were different. Their greatest mystery began after their empire ended. Century after century passed. New kingdoms rose where the Hittites had once ruled. Languages changed. Religions evolved. Roads shifted. Great cities were built upon older foundations. Travelers crossed the hills of Anatolia without realizing they were walking through the heart of a forgotten superpower. Somehow, one of the greatest civilizations of the Bronze Age had almost vanished from human memory. Egypt was remembered. Babylon was remembered. Assyria was remembered. The Hittites were almost completely lost. Then, thousands of years later, the earth began giving back its secrets. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers and archaeologists returned to the lonely hills surrounding Hattusa. At first, they found scattered stones, broken walls, and mysterious carvings. Interesting, certainly, but nothing that prepared them for what lay beneath the soil. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Clay tablet after clay tablet emerged from collapsed buildings, each covered with lines of wedge-shaped writing. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became an ancient library, unlike anything anyone expected to find. Imagine holding a message that no human being had read for more than 3,000 years. Imagine realizing the hands that pressed those symbols into wet clay believed they were writing for their own generation, never imagining they were sending a message across 30 centuries. Those tablets gave the Hittites something more valuable than treasure. They gave them their voice back. As scholars slowly translated the tablets, an entire civilization stepped out of the shadows. Kings whose names had vanished returned to history. Laws reappeared. Religious ceremonies were understood once again. Diplomatic letters revealed conversations with Egypt. Military campaigns, trade agreements, royal marriages, and everyday administration emerged from the silence. Piece by piece, archaeologists reconstructed a civilization so sophisticated that historians had to rewrite the story of the ancient Near East. The Hittites had not been a forgotten tribe or a minor kingdom. They had been one of the great powers of their age. Their rediscovery reminds us of something both humbling and inspiring. History is not a finished book. Every excavation has the potential to change what humanity believes about its own past. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden among the stones of Hattusa. Civilizations are not remembered simply because they were powerful. They are remembered because someone preserves their story. The Hittites nearly disappeared from history not because they lacked greatness, but because time buried their voice beneath layers of earth and silence. Had those clay tablets crumbled into dust, one might never have known their empire existed at all. It makes you wonder how many other forgotten civilizations still sleep beneath forests, deserts, mountains, or modern cities, waiting patiently for the first shovel to uncover another chapter of humanity's story. Explorer, before we close this investigation, look once more across the quiet hills of Hattusa. Listen carefully. The wind no longer carries the sounds of chariots or crowded marketplaces. The palace has fallen silent. The temples stand in ruins. Yet the city is not truly gone. Every stone still carries the memory of the people who built it. Every tablet still speaks for the scribes who refuse to let knowledge disappear. And every new archaeological discovery reminds us that the past is never as distant as it seems. The Hittites did not simply vanish. They waited. They waited for someone curious enough to ask the right question, and patient enough to listen when history finally answered. Some mysteries end with a single answer. Others leave behind a trail of questions that continue calling to those willing to search. The Hittites belong to the second kind. Tonight, we follow the evidence through abandoned gates, royal archives, forgotten battlefields, and silent temples. We listen to clues preserved inside clay tablets for more than 3,000 years. We explored the possibility of drought, collapsing trade, political rivalries, outside invasions, and the difficult decisions made by leaders facing an uncertain future. We examined what archaeologists know, what historians continue to debate, and the questions that still remain unanswered. Perhaps we did not solve every mystery, but every great investigation begins by asking better questions. And tonight we took one more step toward understanding a civilization that almost disappeared from human memory. If journeys like this inspire your curiosity, then you found your place. Here at Tilt and Chill, we don't simply tell stories from the past. We reopen history's greatest investigations. Together we'll explore forgotten empires, mysterious castles, remarkable kings and queens, hidden underground cities, sacred mountains, lost civilizations, enduring local legends, and the discoveries that continue reshaping what we know about our world. Every episode is another expedition. Every mystery is another invitation to explore. If that kind of journey excites you, consider subscribing and becoming part of our growing community of explorers. We'd be honored to have you with us on the next investigation. Before we leave Hattusa, I'd like to ask you one final question. Imagine standing upon these great walls during the empire's final years. The harvests are failing. Messengers arrive with troubling news. Trade is slowing. Rumors spread across the kingdom. Would you have stayed to defend the capital until the very end? Or would you have gathered your family, step through the city gates, and search for hope beyond the horizon. There is no perfect answer. That's what makes history so profoundly human. Share your thoughts in the comments. Read what other explorers discovered. Sometimes another perspective reveals a clue we never noticed. Some of the best investigations don't end when the narration stops. They continue through thoughtful conversations among people who share the same curiosity about the world. As we close this case, remember something the Hittites quietly teach us. Great civilizations are not remembered only because of their victories. They are remembered because someone cared enough to preserve their story. Every ruined city, every weathered inscription, every forgotten temple reminds us that humanity's greatest treasures are not always made of gold. Sometimes they are made of knowledge, courage, resilience, and the determination to leave something meaningful behind for generations yet to come. Thank you for spending part of your journey with us. Until our next investigation, keep your curiosity alive. Keep asking difficult questions. Keep exploring places where history, mystery, and human imagination meet. And remember, somewhere in the world, another forgotten story is waiting. We'll find it together here on Tilt and Chill.